today I'm going to demonstrate, or at least I'm going to critique my artwork, and I'm going to try and keep it concise because I have a tendency to ramble. Let's see how that goes. So I've chosen 3 artworks from 2020, which I made during a 10-day continuous art challenge where I was painting photos from Korea because I still do follow, a lot of really amazing Korean photographers. It's really interesting because they all have the same aesthetic, but they capture really beautiful Korean landscapes. And as you can see at the top here, these are just a selection of them. And I did some paintings of them during lockdown in 2020. And I'm just going back and revisiting them to see how I can improve them. In fact, I did an article about it in 2020, so you can check that out. I'll leave the link in the description. But today I wanted to focus on just 3. Even 3 may be too much. Let's see how many I can do. But the reason I chose these 3 is because they all focus on 3 different topics or main topics which they can kind of come under, and so that's what I wanted to go over today. By the way, I'm using the app called Cuppa, which is by WeTransfer. It's a really good journal app. Like, you can make all these different journals and kind of use it like a notebook. It's pretty cool. So let's just jump right into this one. Okay, so this is the first artwork that I'll be analyzing, which is by, I'll put all the photographer links to their Instagrams also down below. I mean, you should follow them. They have really, really amazing work. And the main issue that I found with this is the painting, this image, was the perspective. The perspective is quite wrong in this one. So I'm just going to grab a color which is readable. So you can see in my image, in my painting that I did, the angle of the buildings is like this. Let's make the pen thicker. Yeah, so the angle of the pen is like, sorry, the angle of the buildings is like this, and if I draw a horizontal, obviously I have no idea what the angle is. But let's say that's the angle. Compare that to this angle of the buildings, which steeps down a lot more. If I draw the horizontal, you can see, okay, it doesn't look like there's that much difference now, but there is. You can clearly see that this line is a lot steeper, so I didn't use perspective lines for this drawing, clearly, and you can also see very clearly in the kind of the slope, or not slope, the angle of the zebra crossing compared to my angle. Now, what's interesting is that even when I was doing these paintings, I could tell that they were really wrong, but I had no idea how to fix them. But now that I have more of a grasp of the fundamentals, it's easier for me to see what's wrong. Now, I'm not claiming that I'm a professional artist, that I'm a teacher or anything. I'm just critiquing my own work based on the knowledge that I've gained. And who knows, maybe in a year I can critique it even more, So it's all about building up and consolidating, and what's the word that I'm looking for? When you build up your knowledge, basically. Consecutively building. Yeah, that's it. Kind of in line with the same, in tandem with that subject, I would say, is proportion. So if you look, unfortunately paper doesn't have layers, so I can't turn things on and off, but if you look at the proportions between things, it's kind of wrong. So you can see that let's say the height of this man versus the height of this pole, there's quite a big distance, right? Like, if you look, this is the distance between them, right? But if I compare it to the height of this person that I drew here versus the height of the pole that you can barely see, by the way. Whoops, I brought up this is the pole. So they're kind of equidistant, and now that I realize that it's equidistant, when you're painting, you should try not to make things equal, like, you should try not to make things sit on like the middle of the page, or you should try and make things in thirds, or kind of 80-20, 70-30, that kind of perspective, that kind of proportion, so that it just looks more balanced, it looks more natural. Obviously there is a time and a place for centered drawings or centered photos or whatever, but for this one, that's not the case. you can see that this guy is definitely the focal point, and you have all these leading lines which lead towards this guy, even this one somehow, in some way. So yeah, so the second thing I would say is proportion. That's the second thing. And if I was to kind of take this a step further, I would say the third thing is obviously I made the scene rainy because I made the values really dark. Like you can see the color of, let's grab a red, you can see the color of this sky versus the color of this sky is very, very different because I made the value of this thing too dark. Now I'll talk about value later in another painting. I'm not going to talk about it in this one, but the color is obviously very different, so that's kind of a sub thing. I won't really focus on that for this painting. Alright, let's jump right into the time lapse. So this is me doing the perspective grid of the first painting, but I actually painted this last because I find architecture quite difficult to paint or draw. So, well, paint actually, drawing is not an issue, but painting for some reason really gets me when it comes to architecture. So I'm just blocking in the shapes here, and I'm using Infinite Painter for the entire thing, for this entire video, and it's really great. It's kind of like Photoshop for the iPad, and it's nice because you can see I've got this photo out, I've got my brushes docked on the side and the colour wheel as well up there, so it's nice to have all of that there, even though it can get a bit crowded, but I'm okay with it. So colours and shapes, and I'm using generally two brushes. So I use the palette knife tool, loaded knife paintbrush, which I kind of added a bit of jitter to, and you can see me using that here right now. And I also, to block in the shapes of the buildings, I use the debris fill tool, which is a fill tool which kind of has a slight texture to it. I used the grunge fill tool before, but it has too much texture, and I kind of didn't like that after a while, so it's nice to use a fill tool to get the kind of clean edges and lines that you require in a building or in architecture, but then it's nice to use these more natural and organic brushes for clouds and things like that. You can see that the sky in the actual image is very detailed, but later on I actually simplified it because it was just distracting too much from the actual scene of the painting, and that's what you should learn to do in any painting, is learn to simplify where you can. Obviously you have artistic license, so you can just change things however you want, and that's why I decided to remove the sky. I mean, I was just testing it out but to see if it would help the composition, but it actually ended up working, so I kept it. So now I'm just adding in the lights from the distance, and I'm trying my best again to simplify as possible, because I think I made the best version of this painting is that I just added in all the shapes and tried to render it really accurately, which is just not the best way of doing things. Another tool that I use a lot is the palette knife tool, which is also available on the docked brushes that I have docked on the side. I think it's kind of different to the smudge tool. I think the palette knife basically smudges as well. You can see before I smudged the lights on the road, but it gives kind of a different texture, so that's why I use the palette knife tool. So right now I'm just adding in the lights, and also here I'm trying to figure out the temperature of the road, because as you can see in the reference photo, it's kind of cool towards the front, and then towards the back when you go towards the shops and stuff, it's a lot warmer. So I'm trying to figure out the color temperatures here, and that was something that was really I was having a lot of fun with, and I was really finding myself learning with color temperature and how to change the colors according to that, even though I know I said before that color and value is not of super interest to this painting in particular, but it's still quite interesting to note. And I added in a lot of pink values into the zebra crossing at the front, so it kind of had a tying in or tying back to the sky in the background, so there's like some color harmony running throughout the painting. I don't know if it worked necessarily, but it was a good thing that I tried still. Again, just simplifying the shapes, kind of trying to get the essence of it. And here I'm now blocking in the man, I think this was definitely the least successful part of the painting. I did not, well, first of all, I'm terrible at human anatomy and like drawing people. That's something I really need to improve on. As you can see, that is literally a blob. But anyway, I couldn't really get like the shadows and light correct for this guy. I mean, those trousers are way too light. You can see me trying to darken it there. It didn't really work. I guess now I'm looking at it, the guy's trousers are a lot warmer than well, the guy's entire outfit is a lot warmer than what I've drawn it as, and he just doesn't have a lot of structure. And so I'm simplifying this guy right here, as I mentioned before, trying to see if it works, and I feel like it just kind of, yeah, it just simplified the composition a lot, definitely, because it brought the attention back down to the ground where it should be. The lighting on the street, the road itself, tells us a lot of information which you don't see, you know, outside of the canvas, like what kind of road is on either side of this guy. Like I'm assuming the road that's kind of horizontal that he's crossing right now is a lot less busy, or at least on the right side there's fewer shops and things like that because it's darker, whereas obviously the vertical road, or the road that's kind of that he's walking towards, is a lot busier. It's got a lot of lights. Maybe it's a busy high street kind of thing. So it's interesting to kind of see what clues you can pick up to try and piece the rest of the story, which is kind of really. And now I'm just trying to compare the two, putting them side by side. Here I'm adding those pink touches. It's a bit too jarring now that I look at it, the pink. A bit too distracting, so I just added in the green of the crossing just to kind of bring more focus or attention to the guy, because it's near to where the guy is. And yeah, that's about it for this painting. Just doing a few more smudges to kind of add some visual interest. Yeah, that was this painting. Let's move on to painting number 2. Okay, so this is the second painting that I'm going to be talking about. And like I said before, which I kind of spoiled for you, what the main issue with this painting is, value. So if you don't know what value is, I feel like people get very confused with this. Even I was very confused. Value is basically how light or dark something is. So when I was doing this painting, I could not capture that lightness, that kind of sense of, I mean, I guess it's dawn light. It could be sunset as well, actually. But that kind of lightness of the daytime. Let's assume it's morning. I couldn't capture that. You can see that my values are way darker, like super dark. Like look at the value of this and look at the value of this. If I was to turn this iPad black and white, in fact, I might just do that. Okay, so I turned this iPad black and white. There's a shortcut key to do that, which Angry Miko showed on his channel. I'll link the video to that below. But basically I pressed on the power button 3 times. You can do that in the settings. Anyway, now that you can see that it's black and white, this is basically a value painting. So you can see the values of something, and you can clearly see that this is a lot lighter than my painting. And just in general, the entire thing is way darker than this painting. So that's the main thing that I got wrong. Let's turn this back into color. That's the main thing that I got wrong with this painting. Majorly the values, and I know that now that I know that, I know it's actually a relatively simple fix, comparative to things like perspective, where you have to think about things a bit more. I mean, okay, I guess you're thinking with different parts of your brain, but anyways, so that's the first thing. So let's put down value. Now you have to think about value first before you think about color. Color is kind of like the icing on the cake. You don't actually have to worry about color as long as you get your values right. If your values are incorrect, then color doesn't matter. Like, you can argue that yes, this is green and yes, this is pink, but because the value is not correct, it doesn't look right, you know, when I compare it to the reference. So once I get the values right, then I can start focusing on the color. So which is the second thing I would like to point out is wrong with this image. So the colors are obviously way too saturated. But like I said, if I get the value correct, then the color should follow suit. For example, if I'm going to take this this light value of this cloud, let's take these clouds for example. Once I lighten up this value, this purple value, it will automatically just look correct, even if the color is not the exact same color as this one. It doesn't matter because the value is correct. So technically, if I just get the eraser tool, color doesn't really sit on a separate subject. It actually just sits underneath value. So I'm gonna make this 1.5 actually. Number 1.5. And with that, let's move on to the second painting. Now this painting I actually painted first because it's kind of more of the easy painting to start with, and honestly I think it was the most successful because I definitely achieved the aim of what I wanted to get out of this painting, which was, as I mentioned, value. So I don't know what I was thinking when I was painting this back in 2020 because it's absolutely so different to the main reference, and this time I was determined to like keep my values in the light and the spectrum, as you can see me doing here. So all of the values are kind of pastel, like the sky at least, and what was really important here was trying to keep the values the same but shifting the color temperature. So as you can see in that reference photo that I just made bigger, there's more of a blue temperature at the top, and then moving towards the bottom it's like all it's quite difficult. I'm beginning to change the temperature but keep value the same, but as long as you're kind of in the same area of the color spectrum for each hue, then it's, you know, you should at some point get it. So I also blocked in the dark values, which is obviously the green, not the foreground, but the ground. And I was, again, this was all about values because you have this really dark foreground, where the house sits, and then you have, fading into the distance, you have the greens. So I was trying to capture that, and I was also smudging out with a palette knife. I wanted this more interesting, so I decided to make the clouds kind of puff out as like it's a cloud of smoke from this house, which is why I clustered everything, because I wasn't really a big fan of the way the clouds were clustered in the photo. It doesn't really give a story or add anything, so that's why I decided to go for this composition, again employing artistic license. I think the cloud was definitely, it was definitely the most challenging, because here the color shifts are subtle with regards to it looks, you know, the color blending is really nice. The value shifts in color, or the shifts in value. So yeah, I mean, the rest of the painting I just keep adding trees, and I add some windmills later on, again trying to keep the value as subtle as possible. See on the water there's some kind of green, some things I removed that because it wasn't really adding to the picture. So that's what I love about painting, is that you can kind of just do what you want to make the composition look better. I think the main improvement that I have with this painting is definitely the house. Like I mentioned before, or did I? I'm not sure. I use the grunge fill tool a lot, but I realized later on as I was doing my final painting that it wasn't the best tool to use at times, especially when it came to texture, and you need differences in texture as well. You need solid areas and you need textured areas. So I would definitely either use the debris fill tool or the solid fill tool for the house next, so it doesn't look so textury and grungy, because the house shouldn't really look like that because the rest of the landscape is very textured. I'd also probably darken the ground plane a bit, make the dark value even darker, because that's how it is in the photo. And looking back on it, I think there's also a, on the right side of the reference photo, it's a lot lighter, so with my painting. I didn't really reference where the sun was coming from. I mean, you can tell because the pink side is on the right side, so you can kind of tell, but there's no direct light or kind of diffused light in this painting like there is in the reference photo, so that's definitely something that I would try and work on. Again, it's not an easy thing. Actually, trying to paint subtly is a lot more harder than trying to paint in an obvious way. So that was what was difficult about this painting. But this painting was just a lot of really subtle brush strokes and color shifts, and yeah, I really, really appreciated this process, and I learned a lot of temperature and value doing this painting. And now let's move on to the final painting. Now moving on to the final painting which I wanted to discuss today. The main issue that I found with this painting, but actually before that, let's talk about what I liked about this painting, which is I think the rendering is it's okay. Like I've put in effort and detail, and I still remember doing all these paintings actually, and I remember I put in a lot of effort trying to render everything because I was like, why is this painting not working? So I thought that rendering everything would solve the issue, which is why I spent a lot of time, using the trees. I used this specific brush on Procreate to get this texture. I rendered this entire Seoul Tower, Namsan Tower, trying to just make it look accurate and correct, and I still wasn't happy by the end of it. But now I kind of have an idea of why I'm not. And actually, this is a problem that beginners do a lot, which is we render everything, and you don't need to render everything. Because there's a problem that comes with that, and that problem is you don't have a focus point, you don't have a focal point. The whole point of a painting or photograph is to create a focal point, is to find a subject and make sure that everything in that painting or everything in that composition draws your eye towards that focal point. So if I was going to choose a focal point in this photo, and what I assume this photographer made the focal point of his photo is, of course, if the app allows me, is Namsan Tower. It's clearly, everything is kind of, the trees are pointing up towards it, you have these telephone wires pointing towards it. Even the road itself is going upwards, it's sloping upwards. So everything is pointing upwards to focus on this tower. And I understood that when I was painting this, but I didn't understand how to execute that in a painterly fashion. So if I was going to do this differently, I would not render everything. I would choose specific things that are relevant to the focal point, which is obviously Namsan, and I would ensure that kind of those things look good in relation to that. So if I was going to do this painting again, which hopefully I will by the end of this video, is I would obviously render Namsan very well. I'd render the road relatively well, and I'd also render the person. So I have a little figure here which kind of gets a bit lost in the shadows. The reason I'd render all three of these things well is because this is the focal point, this is the first subject, this leads up towards the tower, and this person is because our eye normally gets drawn to human figures, so it should look relatively good. And then everything else, including the car, including the trees and all of that stuff, I would not render as much because they are not as important. They don't add more to the story if I rendered them all. In fact, they just distract if I keep rendering them. Like, for example, I rendered this car as much as I could, and it's pointless. Like, if I was gonna, draw all of these little details of the car, there's no point because the car is not important. So, first of all, you have to determine your focal point and then render only that, and render only the things which lead towards your focal point, and everything else you give impressions of. You don't have to render it fully because it will just distract from the subject. So that's the first thing, is create a focal point. Now, obviously, because I was referencing these amazing photos, it's very obvious what the focal point is. In real life, when you're painting, it's not as obvious. You have to make the focal point. But that's another subject entirely. The second thing that I think it kind of relates to this, again, it's more of a 1.5 point actually, is depth or atmospheric perspective. So in this, obviously you can tell that, you know, over here it gets a bit darker, and over here it's lighter because the sun, let's get yellow. Where's the yellow? Yeah, so the sun is coming from here, and then, you know, it's lighting up these parts, and let's get a blue. It's shadowy in these parts. Sorry, that's a terrible drawing, but terrible diagram. But anyways, you get the idea. So I was not able to capture that in this. You know, you can see this part here is just as light as the road, and it shouldn't be like that. Again, this kind of goes back to value, actually. No, it's definitely a value issue. I had no idea how to make this darker. I mean, I didn't know the reason, actually, why it looks wrong. So I didn't know that I needed to make it darker. These sound like really obvious things, but to be honest, they are things that you don't actually realize when you are a beginner painter. So, yeah, so next time when I'm painting this, I would obviously make this area a lot darker, including the trees in that area. Because even though the trees in this photo look, all of them look lit up by the sunlight, as an artist, you can kind of take liberties and creative license to change things in order, again, to serve your focal point. So all of this stuff, like all of these windows and the signs, and like literally I remember trying to render everything, trying to render the letters of this, I think it's a church or something. You don't need to do that, right? Like once you make this entire area dark, then half of the details are just gone, which is great because, again, you don't need to focus on this area. It's not a focal point. What you need to make light is this area. And in fact, actually, it's something that just occurred to me, which would be really cool, is if I actually, oh, let's not get rid of that. If I made all of this dark, you know, this entire area dark, and then I just made this area light. And that would actually serve the painting really well because, one, it creates that 2/3, 1/3 rule, and two, it creates a contrast of value if I did that. So actually, maybe I will do that. And let's just do a very quick, this might be useful as well, let's do a very quick thumbnail to show that. So if I'm gonna, let's just take, thumbnails are also a very great way to start a painting. I think I made a video about it. Thumbnails, I can't remember. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. If I didn't, then that's a great video idea. So all of this is in shadow, let's say, and then this, get the little, oh, this is, some of the pens are used as diagrammatic pens, so they'll automatically create straight lines, which is kind of annoying sometimes. Yeah, so yeah, it would kind of look like that. Obviously, you'd have shades of darkness so that you can tell that there are different things in the shadow. Like the road is darker or whatever. And then you can kind of draw the figure, I don't know, like, however. You can draw the figure in a different color temperature. I wouldn't draw the figure in a lighter shade. Anyways, I'm getting into details. That's not the point of this section of the video. So, what was I going to write here? Yeah, atmospheric perspective. Atmospheric perspective. I'm just going to write perspective. Yeah, there we go. So that's what I would change about this painting. All right, and we are now in the final stretch. It's been useful. MVP. Again, I'm just doing the blocking in with pencil to this and above. And I decided to change the composition for this one so that it leads up towards Namsan Tower. So again, just to kind of give it a bit more story. And I flipped the composition as well, I think. Yeah. I mean, here I'm drawing it flipped. I don't know. Anyways, the final composition, I think, was not like this. I drew it in my previous painting, but I think I changed it. Like, I removed the person. The final outcome was quite grayed out, I think, even though I quite liked it. And it was better than the previous painting. adding the trunks and also adding shadows in the on the ground or the road. I actually quite like the way I rendered the car. I was just looking at the rectangles and kind of the quadrilaterals that make up the car, and I'm glad I did because it looks more like a car now. Or like a truck, should I say. It's still quite not as shadowy as it should have been, perhaps. And as I was painting, I used the palette knife tool to smudge out some areas, which I think obviously it was a way to try to achieve what I wanted, which was to bring the focal point to become Namsan Tower. I feel like this was probably the least successful in terms of what I set out to achieve, but it was getting there. It was getting there, definitely. Because in the end, I kind of really liked painting the car so much that I gave it a bit more detail than I expected. So then I was kind of like, oh, should I make that? Because when you have an architectural icon like a tower, it's kind of hard not to make that the focus. But anyways, overall, I think the painting was quite okay. And in that circle around Namsan, I rendered the trees as much as I could without blurring them out, so that, you know, the areas where you want to give focus, you put obviously the most detail. So that's what I was doing and what I'm doing here. And I'm just blurring out the road shadows to stop it being so textured, because again, you need difference in texture. And yeah, that's pretty much it for this painting. But thank you so much for watching, if you've watched all the way up until now. And I will see you next week for another video, which with that, I'll see you next week. Bye.